WeatherXM is set out to become the largest weather network in the world and disrupt the multi-billion-dollar weather industry. And the timing could not be any more perfect because with the emergence of AI, well, there's never been a bigger need for weather data. Now, traditionally, we've seen about a 1 day advancement in weather forecasts every 10 years. In other words, the 7 day forecast today is as good as the 6 day forecast was 10 years ago. But in recent years, due to AI, we have seen unprecedented advancements in weather forecasts. In fact, Google recently showcased their new AI weather forecast tool, GenCast, and they've been more accurate than traditional forecasts roughly 97% of the time. That said, just like with any AI, well, it's only as good as the data that you input into the model. And there is still a massive need for more weather data, and that is where WeatherXM comes into play. Their goal is to build the largest weather network in the world and improve coverage in areas that have traditionally lacked weather data using a token incentive model, hence it being a DePIN. It's incredibly important because weather impacts nearly every industry. And there is a huge total addressable market for WeatherXM to tap into. And that is, of course, the first thing I want to cover, which is what are the potential use cases for this data and where's the revenue going to come from? But before I get started, I have to remind you, nothing in this video is financial advice. You should always do your own research. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. Now, the first category I want to touch on is agriculture. And I believe that this is the largest opportunity for WeatherXM, especially in the short term, but I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. But farmers across the world heavily rely on weather forecasts as it helps them make more informed decisions to optimize crop yield, resource management, and overall productivity. For example, farmers need to know if there's going to be rainfall so they know when to spray their crops. Or when it comes to irrigation, which is the #1 use of fresh water globally, they need to know how much to irrigate their crops to avoid damaging them. And as we continue to see water shortages across the world, this is going to be a major focus. The next is insurance, as we've continued to see natural disasters on the rise. In fact, in the US, we used to see a billion-dollar weather event roughly every 4 months. We're now seeing this every 3 weeks, and not just billion-dollar weather events. These are in the tens of billions of dollars in many cases. Having more forewarning leading up to these extreme weather events can not only save a tremendous amount of lives, but will give people more time to protect their assets, which can greatly minimize the damages associated with the weather events. And I'll give you an example. Back in 2023, when Hurricane Otis hit Acapulco, they only had 4 hours advance warning. And this resulted in the deaths of 50 people and $15 billion in damages. It's estimated that if they just had 2 days notice, most if not all of those lives would have been saved and the damages would have been cut down by about a third. And on a global scale, it's estimated that as weather forecasts continue to improve, we could see as much as $162 billion in savings when it comes to damages from these extreme weather events. Now, obviously, all of that has a downstream impact on the cost of insurance. Having more granular weather data on a hyper-local level will also help insurance companies properly assess risk. The next category is transportation, and I want to give you an example when it comes to aviation specifically. Now, let's say a flight is preparing to take off and they know that the destination is going to have inclement weather for a short period of time. Well, they can add additional fuel, allowing that aircraft to circle around for a period of time, reducing the chance that they would have to divert to a completely different airport altogether. Now, I know that doesn't sound like a huge deal, but for airlines that operate on pretty thin margins at 2.7%, flight delays are incredibly costly. And these minor improvements can add up in a big way with the amount of volume that they do. Retail is another industry that's heavily impacted by weather. Now, let's say that a Home Depot, for example, can see a week from now in a specific area that temperatures and humidity are above a certain threshold. And the last time this happened, they saw a 3x spike in their air conditioning sales. Well, they can now plan ahead and stock their shelves to meet that demand. And looking at construction, that's an industry that's starting to see a lot of emerging use cases. Now, let's say that on a specific job site, you know that within this 3-hour window that the wind loads are going to exceed what's allowable to operate a crane. Well, you can now send that employee to a different job site to be more efficient with their time. And when it comes to energy infrastructure, well, we're seeing some examples out of New York City. ComEd, their electric utility, is piloting a program where they've deployed 17 weather stations to better plan for building out infrastructure. That's because in major cities, you have hotspots where the temperatures and the climates are quite different than other areas of the city. By having insight into that, they can plan ahead and add more steam vents or more cabling in specific areas that need it, which will save them a tremendous amount of money in the long run. Now, those are just a handful of examples, but there's obviously a massive market for WeatherXM to tap into, but I always ask the question, is there a path or a differentiator for them to grab market share? Well, from a high level view, I really see two major paths for them to generate revenue. The first is from individuals. If you look here at their WeatherXM Pro platform, you can pull up different weather stations across the world. And they are building out their own forecasting tools. And obviously, as they continue to get more data, those forecasting tools will only get better. Now, they are launching a free version of their forecasting tool, but also a premium version that has extra features. And to purchase that subscription, you will use the WXM token. But this platform also allows you to create APIs to pull the data. And that is where I see the bigger opportunity, because there are a lot of weather analytics companies out there that are already tapping into all the industries that I mentioned and already have revenue coming through the door. They just need more data. So WeatherXM will be able to charge and pull revenue through these analytics companies. That is, as long as these analytics companies see the data as valuable. Now, once WeatherXM is the largest weather network in the world, well, that's a pretty big differentiator, but it's going to take time. So they need to have a short-term differentiator to get their foot in the door with these analytics companies. And I do believe that they have a really genius short-term strategy. Now, to understand what they're doing, we need to dig into how the weather industry has worked to this point. It's been mostly funded by governments. When you look at NOAA, the government entity responsible for weather forecasting in the US, they receive roughly $7 billion in funding per year to deploy and maintain their network of roughly 14,000 weather stations. They get an additional $1.3 billion for forecasting. We see a similar situation with countries across Europe. The same cannot be said, however, for many developing countries, as they don't have that type of government funding. And as a result, their weather forecasts are severely lacking. In fact, it's estimated that the 7-day forecast in the US is as good as the 1-day forecast in many of these other countries. And this is a huge problem, especially for agriculture. That's because these developing nations are where 78% of harvested croplands preside. And the lack of weather data has made it very difficult for these farmers to get crop insurance, largely in part because these insurance companies don't have enough data to do proper risk assessment. As a result, there's $1 trillion worth of farmland that's uninsured right now in these developing nations. And in recent years, we're seeing that once every 5 years, their crops are getting destroyed, mostly by weather events. And this is a massive problem, and one that WeatherXM is solving. They've launched a program called Targeted Deployments, and they're targeting specific regions like India, Africa, and Latin America. And the way it works is that they have investors that want to deploy weather stations, and they team them up with deployment businesses and connect them with farmers that need this weather data. Now, the investors and deployers split the token rewards, the farmers get the data, and on the back end, WeatherXM has created a program where they're working with insurance companies and getting them this data so that these farmers have a path now to get crop insurance. So obviously this is a win-win for everyone involved, but where the real genius comes into play is from a higher level view, because they now have data that isn't available anywhere else. This data isn't just valuable for farmers, it's available for all the other industries that I mentioned across these countries. It's also worth noting that this weather data isn't just valuable for these countries because the weather in a country yesterday becomes the weather in other countries in the days to follow. In fact, weather is one of the rare examples of successful international collaboration. So this weather data is obviously very valuable to these analytics companies and is going to allow WeatherXM to get their foot in the door with them and establish revenue in the short term. And then obviously, as the network continues to grow, those revenue streams will grow with it, especially if they can become the largest weather network in the world. And let's dig into those numbers. So in order to achieve this feat, they would have to deploy about 250,000 weather stations. And that's not their ultimate goal, by the way. They want to hit 1 million weather stations. Now, while it will take time, I do think it's a matter of when and not if. Now, hear me out. There's currently 3 different options for deployment. Now, you have the helium-enabled version, which connects to the Helium IoT network, and the Wi-Fi version that would connect to your Wi-Fi connection, both at $400. And you have the Pulse, which is the 4G LTE version. So if you're in an area where you don't have any connectivity through Wi-Fi or the Helium network, you can go this route. Well, I can tell you from my personal experience, and I've deployed several of the Helium versions, it's super easy. You can connect in a matter of minutes. You don't have to connect any wires. You just mount this thing up on the roof. Now, I also deployed about 70 Helium hotspots on rooftops across the country. Yeah, that was a lot more difficult, having to run power over Ethernet to the roof. You also had to purchase a lot of ancillary equipment, antennas and lightning arresters and outdoor enclosures. Now, I bring this up because the Helium network did reach roughly 1 million IoT hotspots deployed, mind you, in the midst of supply chain shortages. And those were not only far more costly, but a lot more difficult to install. So I absolutely do think they'll get there. It's just not going to happen overnight. But because they have this short-term path to revenue through these developing nations, I don't think they really need to become the largest weather network tomorrow. But the question is the team capable of pulling it all together? For one, I'll say that several of their team members grew up in Greece and have family members that were in agriculture, so they definitely understand the need for weather data from that perspective. Let's take a look at their CEO. In this case, you'll see that their CEO, Manolis, has ample experience in IoT. And nearly 10 years ago, he actually launched a weather company focused on predictive analytics. The other thing I'll say about this is in listening to some of the interviews that he's done, it's been his dream to create a decentralized weather network long before DePIN was even a thing. It wasn't until he drew inspiration from the Helium network back in 2019 that he decided to go the DePIN route. This has been a goal of his for a very long time. And the reason why that's super important is that if you're going to be an effective leader, you need to live and breathe what you're doing every single day. And I have no question that this guy is very committed to making this a successful project. And speaking of his commitment to the project, if we look at the tokenomics or the token distribution, roughly 55% are going to station deployers or the individual participants. Now, I'm big on putting your money where your mouth is. And when you compare this to a lot of other projects in the space that are 30 to 40% allocation to participants, at 55%, I think it's very clear that they're committed to making this thing happen. The other thing I want to call out, if we look at the token right now at 47 cents, just over a $28 million market cap, the total supply of tokens. Okay, so there's 100 million tokens. When you compare that to other projects in the DePIN space, most of them are at a billion, some of them at 10 billion. So that's certainly something to keep in mind when you're looking at token valuations. And that's all I'm going to say about that. And just to remind you, nothing in this video is financial advice. But in summary, WeatherXM has a massive total addressable market to tap into. And I believe that they do have the differentiation necessary to drive revenue and the leadership that can pull it all together on the back end and a more than fair tokenomics distribution. And it's for those reasons that I believe WeatherXM is going to be very successful moving forward. Very excited to see how things play out in 2025 and into the future. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. As always, I appreciate your viewership. Signing off, this is Bradley Meyer with the DePIN Connection.